Hello, I'm Dr. Gloria Horsley.
And I'm her daughter, Dr. Heidi Horsley.
Heidi and I want to welcome you to Open to Hope Conversations, the podcast.
We believe that the greatest gift you can give yourself after a loss is hope, using this moment to connect with others who have not only survived but thrived.
So let's get started. Welcome to the Open to Hope Show. I'm your host, Dr. Gloria Horsley, with my daughter and co-host,
Dr. Heidi Horsley.
Well, Heidi, we're going to be talking about some important things and loss and mental illness with an expert in the field. And she not only talks the talk, but she has walked the walk herself. So you're going to receive some wonderful information today on dealing with mental illness and loss. Heidi, would you like to introduce our guest?
Sure. Our guest today is Dr. Margaret Chisolm. She is a professor of psychiatry at Johns Hopkins University, and she is the author of the book, From Survive to Thrive, Living Your Best Life with Mental Illness. In her book, she talks about her own battle with depression and the loss of her brother and cousin to suicide. Welcome to the show, Meg.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's great to meet all of you.
It's wonderful to have you on the show. And Heidi and I are very involved with a lot of grief organizations, particularly the Compassionate Friends. And of course, Heidi's brother died when she was 20.
I lost my cousin when I was in my 20s, but I lost my brother when I was, it was just 12 years ago.
I was a clinical nurse specialist in psychiatry when my son was killed in an automobile accident, 17. And, you talk the talk and walk the walk. And boy, when you have to do it, it's tough, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, it was quite a shock.
Our brothers come into our lives at relatively the same time around. And, we take our journey in our life, we walk with them through life together. And we expect them to be by our sides for monumental events. And we expect to grow old with them. And we expect to die at relatively the same time. So, I think to lose a brother is such a significant loss. I don't think some people realize how profound it is. And it's like, who am I now that my brother's not here? And I know that you really, you acknowledge and validated the significance of the sibling loss. And I appreciate that, because there's not enough out there of, not enough people talking about these losses, these kinds of losses. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you for sharing your story as well.
Mm-hmm. Now, I was wondering how you coped with it.
It was challenging. I'm in a department where people are fairly open about their illnesses. We have a real mission in our department at Johns Hopkins to destigmatize psychiatric illness, and that includes talking about it when we're experiencing it or when we've had losses. And we've had people in our department, faculty and staff, who've lost children and siblings and others, family members to suicide. So we're fairly open in talking about it, but nevertheless, I think being a mental health professional and losing someone to suicide, there's this extra burden, this extra level of guilt that, here we have so much knowledge and expertise and still weren't able to help our own family member. So there's that added layer of professional guilt as well.
One of the big things they say is talk about it, tell people about it. That seems to be a lot of the training for dealing with long-term grief reactions, is talk about it. But how is that for a professional like you?
Yeah, so I certainly have talked about it with my colleagues, but this is a question. I train a lot of psychiatry residents. I'm the vice chair for education in our department, so I meet all of our psychiatry residents and work closely with a handful of them. And this question comes up all the time because many of them have experienced episodes of depression. So it comes up a lot when they're treating patients in their training, and they're wondering, how much do I disclose? And so we usually advise against disclosing these details with our patients, because we really want patients and their problems to be at the center of our attention, and we don't want to intrude on that. But B, because we can use our experiences to empathize with the patients and to have a shared understanding without disclosing the direct experience. Because oftentimes patients will compare themselves to us and either discount that, they're somehow different, they're not going to get better from their depression, or why did this work for you and not me, or feel, that there's some distancing that goes on with some of that, those comparisons. So I typically train people not to disclose to patients, but to use their experiences to build the rapport with patients.
So, Meg, I'm just wondering, what do you think that individuals most need after a family member has died by suicide?
Well, I think they need hope that life is going to go on for them, and that they'll be able to make some meaning of this random, tragic event that they didn't bring on, that no one wished for. So, so I think that's my main goal as a clinician when I'm helping people cope with loss, is to help them make meaning from that experience, and that somehow not only helps them heal, but may even be able to help other people who experience a similar loss.
When you say make meaning, what do you mean?
I think people will tell stories to themselves to help process the loss, and some of those stories might not be the most helpful. So people might feel, if they're religious, they might feel like they've somehow done something in their relationship with God to bring this on, or they might tell themselves stories about things that they could have done to prevent this, or there may be many stories that people tell themselves after a loss that aren't really that helpful. And so thinking about a more helpful story, how can they put this into a framework that actually can provide a sense of meaning for them? So for instance, no one wishes for a loss like this to happen. In my case, for instance, with my brother, I was able to process it by saying, okay, how can I use this experience to help other people? I didn't wish this, I wish it could have been prevented. I couldn't prevent it. But how can I use this in a way that is going to help someone else? So that's a way of making meaning of this tragic event, and I think people can do that in very small ways as well as large ways, right? Your organization is helping to make meaning of this tragic event that happened in your family. But people in small ways, by just disclosing their experience to someone else, can be supporting someone else. And that's a way of giving this event some meaning.
So Meg, I get a question often from people that are grieving, and they wonder if they have clinical depression or if they are just grieving, and they have a hard time teasing it out. So how would they know whether or not it's a depression or a grief response?
Well, it's really hard cross-sectionally, meaning if just taking a snapshot of how someone's looking when they're grieving, it's almost indistinguishable from a major depressive episode. But this is why we use this diagnostic and statistical manual in psychiatry, and this is why it's not always that helpful, because cross-sectionally people can have trouble sleeping, they can have trouble eating, they can feel sad, weepy, they might have low energy, have lost interest in things. These are all symptoms of depression, but they're all also symptoms of grief and normal bereavement. And it's really looking at people over time and to see, everybody's different, and the time that it takes someone to work through their grief and to process it and to start moving forward, and picking up after their grief, that varies from person to person. So I don't want to say, if this has lasted a year, you're depressed or anything like that, even though many clinicians want to say that. I would just say that there's some features to depression that are a little different than grief. And some of those are if you're feeling extraordinarily guilty to the point where your thinking is distorted, and even those around you are saying, no, that isn't making sense. You didn't cause this. You didn't, you don't need to punish yourself for this. It's really more sort of some subtle qualities that happen in depression that really aren't seen in normal, bereavement and grief reactions. And the kind of sadness is a little different. The weepiness with depression, it's usually pervasive and sustained. And with grief, it can be more intermittent. There can be times where just out of the blue, you feel weepy in depression, but with grief, it's really more triggered by thoughts of your loved one. And it's more a welling up of tears in response to a memory or a thought.
Mhm, mhm. Well, I wanted to get to your book.
The book is called From Survive to Thrive, Living Your Best Life with Mental Illness. And I have some mixed feelings about having the word mental illness in the title, because really what I'm talking about is mental life and when it goes awry. Not every abnormal mental experience, or not every psychiatric feel symptom, meaning a change in your thinking or your feeling or your actions, not everything is due to a disease. And so the way I would frame it is, everybody has a mental life, just like everybody has a physical body. And sometimes there are problems that develop in the physical body, and there's sometimes problems that develop in our mental life. Unlike physical problems, which are almost always related to a broken part or function of the body, sometimes our psychiatric problems are mental problems. When our mental life goes awry, sometimes that's because of a disease in the brain or the body, but oftentimes it's because of just normal reaction to a difficult situation. Sometimes it's because of something we're doing, like restricting our food intake or using substances. And sometimes it's just because of our personality, which is neither good nor bad, but in this particular situation, it might be a problem. So I would frame it as, the book would be helpful for anyone understanding their mental life. And if they're having a change in their thinking or their emotions or their behaviors, this might help them understand where that's coming from, whether it's a mental disease or someplace else. So I think reframing it as more about mental life and problems in thinking, feeling, and behaviors broadens it out and makes it a little more, I guess, less stigmatizing and also more accessible to people who might feel like they don't have any kind of psychiatric disease.
Well, it's a very thoughtful book. And if you are feeling some dis-ease in your mind or whatever, it's a wonderful book to read because you have some clarifications about what's going on, some ideas about what you can do, and thinking about, we've talked about it today, depression, whether it's grief or depression. It's a very clear thinking book, and I highly recommend that people get it.
The book is available on Amazon, but I also have a website for the book, which is margaretchisolmmd.com, and there are links to various sites that sell the book from there. So,
yeah. Well, thank you so much for what you're doing to clarify our mental state and not make it some kind of a catastrophe that can never be overcome, or how do we cope with living with loss and this. I don't know, it can be a struggle. Life can be a struggle.
it can be, but my aim is to really demystify those struggles. These are all this is part of the human condition, and to destigmatize these problems. This is part of you being human.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for you being human and for coming on the show today.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you, Meg. And I love how strengths-based you are. I love how you're destigmatizing things. We are living in a very stressful world. A lot of people are feeling a lot of depression. I think that, like you said, your book can really be for a lot of people out there could
Yeah.
benefit from this, because you're talking about not only surviving during extremely stressful times, but thriving. So thank you so much.
Yeah, there's some opportunities for growth.
Thanks again for being on, and thanks everybody for joining us on the show today. And Heidi and I always want to remind you that if you've lost hope, please lean on ours until you find your own, and God bless.
I'm Dr. Heidi Horsley. You have been listening to Open to Hope, the podcast. You can follow Open to Hope on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. To learn more, visit us at opentohope.com and go to Apple Podcasts to subscribe.
I'm Dr. Gloria Horsley. Join us again next week for another Open to Hope conversation, where we invite you to lean on our hope until you find your own.